The thick, slimy mud of the Thames ran through and between his bare feet. It was a feeling that he knew very well, for he was a man who had worked a long time by the side of the cool, clear Thames. But without shoes on his feet, the mud would run between his toes and lie on his legs, and sometimes he was very pleased to know that there were hairs on his leg that would keep some kind of warmth from his bones. An old man, and he knew it, and he wasn't ashamed to say that he was old. He'd lived a good long life here, working hard at taking all of the paper from off the boats and delivering it to the printers. The long, winding, narrow streets of London were no challenge to him. He knew his way from one place to another. But when no one was looking, he would reach and take a piece of paper for himself. It wasn't as if he could read or write, but he would scratch at a piece of paper and make a diary of the things that he had seen and done, but not with words, but with pictures. Lifting all of the paper had made him strong, and he loved to swim in the cool, calm, clear water of the Thames. And when he would pull his strong fingers through his hair, it would make his hair stand up from the top of his head. He was a brave man, but he'd never really had that much chance to show just how brave he was, and now he was half asleep, even though it was the tail end of a day in September. It was a hot day, and you couldn't really tell whether he was smiling or not, for his lips were straight. But he looked out, and he knew that he'd done a good day's work, and now it was time for him to go home from the side of the cold quay. He walked the way that he would always walk, but he loved the way that the paper felt inside of his dirty shirt. It was ripped and it was torn, but it was the best shirt that he had, and he would keep the paper inside of his shirt so that he could make his diary of pictures. He was always very worried in case the paper would get dirty. He would make his marks on it, but he would brush it clean to make sure that he could draw what he'd seen and what he'd done. Every day he would keep a page, and another page would be kept with another, and now it was a sizable diary, and it was his most precious possession in all of this world. But now, as he was making his way back towards his poor home, he saw something sticking out of the mud. He could tell that it was bright, and on any other day he would have picked it up, but this time, as he stopped to look at it, he could smell smoke in the air, for it had been a long day. Smoke in the air, not just from the ordinary fires inside of the houses, but a choking smoke. And he could hear people screaming, yelling and shouting as he was making his way home. And without thinking, he reached down and picked up this pretty bracelet. It was silver and bright, and he would have knocked on everybody's doors, but now the shouting became louder, and people were throwing things to other hands to catch their most precious possessions were being thrown, and so that they could take them away from the fire that was now devouring the whole of London. It had been a long, dry summer, and the wind was blowing the flames higher and higher. Some were standing and looking and watching, but others were trying to get away from that place. But he picked up the bracelet, and the only thing that he could think of doing was to wrap it about his own wrist. He was quite happy because he had all of his diary in his pack at his back, and now he was running. Some of these people who were throwing the things into the street and placing them inside of the great St. Paul's Cathedral because they didn't think that that would ever get burned down. He didn't wait. He started to run, and he was wondering if he would ever get a chance to swim in the Thames again. But it was when he stopped, far away from the flames, as the day was starting to dawn again, that he could see the thick cloud of smoke that lay over the top of London. And he knew that this was something that he needed to draw about. As he put the bracelet on his wrist, as he was trying to draw his pictures, it slipped down, and instead of there being drawings there, he could see that there were words. There was something magical about this bracelet that he'd found. the one that had brushed against his feet that he'd seen in the street as the flames had grown higher. And there he looked, and instead of drawing pictures, he was writing words, and he could read them. He thought that this was the strangest thing in all of this world. But he went through all of the pictures that he'd drawn, and at the bottom he'd always left a small space, and now he was writing words. Inside of this bracelet he could write. Or he wrote. He could not stop himself from writing. Day after day he would write, and people would want to read the stories of the things that he'd done and look at the pictures of what he had drawn before he had magically been able to learn to read and write. Now, many years later, when age was at his back even more, he would stand there and hold his stick. There it was a beautifully cut and carved stick, and he would look at people walking past him, and he would never tell them that he was the one who had written and drawn the book. But they would be reading in the street. They couldn't stop themselves from reading of the things that he'd done and the life that he'd led by the side of the cold quay. But he didn't have to live there now. For by the magic of that bracelet, which he still held at his wrist, he could write. He didn't need to write inside of it. He would hold a long pencil and he would write stories. Stories that people wanted to read. Well, everyone knew that the rich people had written diaries, kings had written their diaries, historians had written stories, but he had written about ordinary people who lived in London at that time. But he still wasn't satisfied. As he rested on his stick, he thought that he would go back to the new houses that lay in place of the ones that had burnt down. And he said, "Well, boy, you cannot read, you cannot write. Sit here now." And he would take the pencil from out of his hand and he would give it to the boy and show them how to draw, show them how to write. He would give them a chance to draw round shapes. And girls and boys would come to that place. And he would rest easy, smiling, as he watched the sun go down on the new London that had been built since the Great Fire. And he knew that the gift that he had been given, not just to read and to write, but the true magic was the fact that he had taught others to read and write. And there he would look as the sun would flicker on the River Thames, and he would know what it was to be happy.